Imagine driving alone on a dark highway when you realize you're not alone. The cargo behind you isn't what it seems. The driver next to you is your perfect double. And the road is alive. These are the 3 stories that will ruin your travels forever. The sun had barely risen over Interstate 5, cutting through the Oregon landscape, when I signed that stupid contract. My name is Hector, and I have been driving an old, but reliable truck for 15 years. I never refuse a shipment, especially one that pays 5 times the normal rate. The company, a certain Biogen Corporation, was clear and brief. A refrigerated container, origin Portland, destination a private facility in Denver. The only instruction, repeated 3 times by a man with a monotone voice, was simple: never, ever, open the container. The cargo was sensitive, of incalculable value, and any violation would result in severe penalties. I accepted. I needed the money for my sister Lucy's surgery in Los Angeles. The guilt already dwelled in my chest long before I heard the first sound. The first part of the journey was tranquil. The road wound through green hills, and the constant rumble of the engine was a familiar lullaby. The container behind me, a large white vault, remained silent and inert. I maintained the temperature strictly at -5 degrees Celsius, as specified. It seemed like a common job, almost monotonous. But then, a few hours after leaving Portland, a noise emerged. It was not the usual sound of cargo shifting or the refrigeration equipment. It was a dull impact, muffled, as if something soft was beating against the steel wall of the container. My entire body tensed. I looked in the rearview mirror, expecting to see something, anything, but the container was intact. I ignored it. I attributed it to the road movement, to an imperfection in the asphalt. My mind, however, began to wander. What could be worth so much? Organs for transplant? Dangerous biological samples? The rule of not opening seemed increasingly oppressive, a secret locked just a few meters away. The impacts ceased for a time, only to be replaced by a worse sound. Moans. They were low, guttural, a mixture of agony and a plea for help that seemed to come from several throats at once. A cold sweat ran down my neck. That was not animal. It was unquestionably human. The guilt, which I thought was related only to the money, began to gain new layers. What was I transporting? Who was in that icy box? I stopped the truck on a deserted shoulder, my heart pounding against my ribs. The darkness around was absolute, swallowing the light from the headlights. The moans continued, a dark chorus echoing inside my cab. And then they evolved. They became whispers. Whispers that did not come from a single point, but from all sides at once, emanating from the very walls of the container. They whispered my name, Hector. They knew my sister, Lucy. They whispered promises, said there was gold and diamonds inside, riches beyond my imagination. All I needed to do was open the door. My hand trembled on the steering wheel. I looked at the photo of Lucy attached to the dashboard, her sickly smile stabbing at me. Then, the whispers changed tone. They became threats. They described her house in detail, the room where she slept. They promised to visit her if I did not comply. The line between greed and fear dissolved. I was terrified and fascinated. Curiosity is a trap worse than fear. It corrodes reason slowly. That intense cold I maintained now seemed like torture, not preservation. Whatever was inside was alive, conscious, and suffering. The promise of money turned to ashes in my mouth. I needed to know. I needed to see. I grabbed the heavy wrench I keep under the seat, my hands sweating despite the icy temperature of the cab. I got out of the truck, my legs weak. The night was silent. Only the low hum of the compressor broke the stillness. The whispers stopped. A sinister calm hung over me. I walked to the rear of the container, the large door seeming like the entrance to a tomb. My breath formed white clouds in the cold air. With the wrench, I forced the opening lever, not enough to open it completely, but just to create a minimal crack, a slit of a few centimeters. The stench that came out was the first thing to hit me. It was a sweet and rotten odor of spoiled meat and chemical disinfectant, a smell of hospital and morgue. Then, I pressed my head against the icy crack and looked inside. The darkness was deep, but not absolute. A faint reddish light, like that of internal organs, pulsed within. And then my eyes adjusted, and I saw. They were not people. It was a person. A single organic mass, colossal, chained with thick chains to the walls of the container. It was a collage of human bodies, fused together in a way that defied logic. Arms and legs sprouted from torsos at impossible angles. Heads were partially swallowed by backs and chests. Open eyes, glazed, blinked from within the amalgamated flesh. The surface of the thing pulsed rhythmically, a collective and horrendous breathing. A mouth, or what seemed to be a mouth, opened in the center of the mass, and from it came a whisper that went straight to my soul. It no longer promised riches. It said it was cold. I stepped back, my stomach churning. The guilt exploded inside me like a bomb. I was not a driver, I was an executioner. That refrigeration system was not to preserve the cargo, it was to keep it contained, weak. By opening the crack, I had violated the only safety principle. I had warmed the monster. Before I could react, things moved in the darkness. Tentacles, not of rubber or metal, but of living flesh, pale and humanly distorted, shot from the crack. They were fast, made of intertwined fingers and twisted arms, ending in bony claws. One struck me in the chest, not with an impact, but with a cold, wet adhesion. Another wrapped around my leg, pulling me back toward the gaping crack. I screamed, fighting against the inhuman force, but it was like fighting a sea of flesh. The tentacles dragged me, not into the container, but along the ground, toward the front of the truck. They did not want to swallow me, not yet. They twisted, entering the gaps of the chassis, climbing up the wheels, fusing with the metal of my truck. I saw the pulsating flesh spread like a fungus, covering the bodywork, infiltrating the engine. The truck shuddered, a deep, organic tremor. I managed to drag myself back into the cab, slamming the door. My heart seemed to want to escape through my chest. I breathed deeply, trying to regain control. I looked at the pedals, at the steering wheel. It was my only chance. I turned the ignition. The engine did not roar, it groaned. A low, painful sound, like that of a wounded animal. I pressed the accelerator. The response was not mechanical, it was visceral. The truck moved forward with a lurch, as if learning to walk. And then I felt the asphalt under the wheels not as a vibration, but as an itch on my own soles. The streetlights were no longer headlights, they were my eyes, blinking slowly against the darkness. The steering wheel was cold under my hands, but I no longer needed to turn it. A mere thought was enough. A slight mental impulse to the right, and the truck obeyed, turning with a frightening fluidity. I was no longer driving a vehicle. I was the brain of a colossal creature, a parasite trapped in the skull of metal and flesh of this monster. The entity within me, because now it was everywhere, not just in the container, but in the walls, the ceiling, the seats, whispered a new command into my mind. It was no longer a threat or a promise. It was a destiny. It showed me an image in my head, as clear as the photo of Lucy. It was my home, in the quiet town of Bellingham, by the sea. The house where my sister was convalescing. The entity was cold, yes, but not from the cold of the container. It was cold from loneliness. It wanted a family. It wanted to go home, to my home, to join Lucy. A terror so profound seized me that it overrode all other senses. I fought against the control, trying to turn the steering wheel, to brake, to do anything. But my limbs were heavy, and the will of the creature was an ocean against my stream of resistance. My feet, which should have been on the pedals, seemed fused to the floor. The truck, this extension of my own imprisoned body, ignored my efforts and maintained its course, its speed increasing steadily. It knew the way. I felt its anticipation, an ancient and terrible hunger. And that is where you find me, trapped inside this shell of steel and agony, narrating these final thoughts. You who are reading this account, perhaps in a file, perhaps in a message I managed to send in a moment of weakness in the creature's control, listen to me. You think fear is a scare, a scream in the dark. True terror is helplessness. It is knowing that your actions, motivated by greed or by misunderstood guilt, set in motion a chain of events you can no longer control. It is feeling your vehicle, your tool of work, your sanctuary, become your own moving prison. It is knowing that you are the conductor of your nightmare, driving toward the people you love most, an involuntary bearer of a horror that cannot be described. The live cargo is no longer in the container. The live cargo is me, and we are arriving home. The highway I-10 was my only companion that dark night, a ribbon of asphalt snaking through the Arizona desert. I, William, knew every curve of this route between Phoenix and Los Angeles like the back of my hand. My truck, a red Freightliner with plate 1AB2C3, was more than a machine, it was my home on wheels, hauling electronics. The loneliness of the road was a small price to pay to support my wife, Anna, and our young son, Peter, waiting for me at home. The gloom inside the cab was broken only by the green glow of the dashboard needles and the headlights that cut the darkness like a blade. That's when I saw the headlights approaching rapidly from behind, an intrusive presence that shattered the routine. An identical truck to mine, same color, same make, same license plate, pulled up beside me like a ghost. My heart stopped for a moment, confused. How was it possible? I was the only one with that configuration in the fleet. I looked at the driver, and the blood froze in my veins. It was me. Or something that looked exactly like me, but with an empty smile and hollow eyes staring fixedly at me. He didn't blink, didn't move, just smiled in that unnatural way, like a poorly fitted mask. He accelerated and passed me, disappearing ahead as if he had never existed. A feeling of disbelief and fear took hold of me. Maybe it was fatigue, a hallucination from too many hours at the wheel. I shook my head and drove on, trying to ignore the chill down my spine. My attempt to rationalize didn't last long. Minutes later, the headlights reappeared behind me, the same truck. He stayed glued to my tail, his high beams blinding my mirrors. I flashed my lights, signaled, but he didn't back off. He got even closer, almost touching my trailer. I accelerated, trying to create distance, but he matched me with frightening precision. Suddenly, he switched to the left lane and came alongside, forcing me onto the shoulder. Rocks hit the chassis, and I barely maintained control. I looked at him, and his face was no longer perfect. The skin around his mouth seemed stretched too tight, as if it was coming apart, and his eyes were deeper, darker. That smile remained, now twisted, almost a grimace. He began to play with me, like a cat with a mouse. He would disappear into tunnels and reappear behind me instantly, as if teleporting. He forced me off the main highway, onto dark and dangerous back roads I didn't even know. Every time I looked at him, his face was more deformed, with deep furrows on his forehead, his mouth open in a silent laugh that made me tremble. I screamed inside the cab, but no sound came out. My throat was dry with terror. He was no longer my double. He was a grotesque caricature of me, a distorted reflection that had taken on a life of its own. In a moment of distraction, while swerving to avoid a pothole, the mirror truck simply vanished. There was no sign of him ahead or behind. The road was deserted again, and the quiet was more frightening than the pursuit. I took a deep breath, my hands still trembling on the wheel. I needed to stop, to pull myself together. I spotted a gas station up ahead, a faint light in the middle of nowhere. I parked next to a pump, got out of the truck on wobbly legs. The night air was cold, but I was sweating. Upon entering the convenience store, the attendant, a young man named Tyler, looked at me and his eyes widened. He took a step back, his hand going to his chest. I asked what was wrong, and he stammered that I looked scary. I laughed nervously, said it was just fatigue. I asked to fill up and paid with my card. The machine declined the transaction. I tried again, same thing. Tyler looked at the system and said the card didn't exist. I showed him my driver's license, and he compared the photo to me. His face paled. The photo on the license wasn't me, it was that double, with that empty smile and dead eyes. My name, William Smith, wasn't in the system. Tyler stared at me with genuine fear, as if I were a monster. I ran out of the station, my heart pounding out of control. I called Anna on my cell phone, but the line was dead. I tried to access my bank accounts through the app, all blocked. A feeling of despair overwhelmed me. I no longer existed. Someone, or something, had taken my place. I remembered stories other truckers told at stops, legends about drivers who encountered their doubles and disappeared. I decided to investigate. I called a colleague, Michael, who traveled the same route. He answered, but his voice was strange, mechanical. He said he didn't know me, that William Smith was another man, and he hung up. That's when I realized this wasn't about me. It was about what that double would do to my family. That being didn't want my life. It wanted to destroy everything I loved. You who are reading this, somewhere safe, perhaps in your home, think carefully. How would you know if the reflection in the mirror is really you? How would you prove your own identity if the whole world saw someone else? That doubt is the seed of the terror that consumes my soul now. I drove to Los Angeles, where Anna and Peter were. The city was busy, but I felt invisible. I parked near our apartment and watched through the window. There he was, my double, sitting at the dinner table with my family. He looked normal, smiling, but I saw the coldness in his eyes. Anna laughed at something he said, and Peter hugged his legs. My stomach churned. I had to stop him, not to get my life back, but to save them from him. I knew other truckers had disappeared, and their doubles were now living their lives, but always with a tragic end for the families. I found records online of disappearances, all with reports of mirror trucks. Night was falling when I decided to act. I quietly went up to the apartment. The key still worked. The door creaked slightly as it opened, and I entered the living room. There he was, standing, waiting for me, as if he knew I would come. His face was no longer a copy. It was a complete distortion, with elongated features and skin that seemed to be melting. His eyes glowed with a sickly inner light. He whispered softly, saying I was the intruder, that this life was his now. I rushed at him, not out of hatred, but out of a primal instinct to protect. We fought in silence, our bodies crashing against the furniture, until I managed to pin him to the floor. I looked into his eyes and saw the absolute void, the lack of a soul. He laughed, a dry, hoarse sound, and then his body began to dissolve into a dark smoke, disappearing completely. But it was too late. Anna entered the room, screamed when she saw me. She didn't recognize me. She saw only a violent stranger. Peter cried, hiding behind her. I tried to explain, but the words wouldn't come out. The police were called, and I fled, returning to my truck. Now, I drive without a destination, a ghost on the road, knowing I've lost everything. My double may be gone, but the reflection he left on the world is more real than I am. And if you, on your travels, ever find a truck identical to yours, look closely at the driver. If it's you smiling, run. Because some mirrors don't reflect light, they give back the worst in us. The detour sign on I-40 in Arizona seemed ordinary, a red arrow pointing to a dirt road to the right, but something about its excessive rust and lack of any official logo made me hesitate. I, David, a trucker from Phoenix, had always trusted my gut, but that stifling afternoon, the urgency to deliver a load of goods to Albuquerque pushed me forward. I turned, and almost immediately the asphalt vanished, replaced by a rough, reddish dirt path that didn't appear on any of my maps or GPS. The outside world, with its blue skies and sounds of life, seemed to retreat like a dream, shrouded by a sudden thick fog that arrived from nowhere. Within minutes, I knew something was deeply wrong. My truck, a Freightliner that had always been fuel efficient, began consuming diesel at a frightening rate, the fuel gauge needle dropping visibly with each mile. But it wasn't just the fuel disappearing, it was a weariness seeping into my bones, as if my very life energy was being drained. The road was not static, it moved subtly, like a serpent adjusting beneath the wheels. Twisted, moss-covered trees lined the edges, their branches intertwining like bony fingers whispering ancient secrets. Animal skeletons, from small rodents to a large deer, dotted the roadside, their bleached bones arranged in patterns that suggested ritual, not accident. Ancient vehicles, a rotting wooden wagon and a truck from the 1950s, lay abandoned, all covered in vines that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. I glanced at the dashboard clock. It was stuck exactly at 3:47 p.m., the same time as my wristwatch and cell phone, all frozen, as if time itself had ceased in this place. I tuned the radio, hoping for a human voice, but instead, a low, persistent static filled the cab. Within it, a whispering voice emerged, speaking in a language I had never heard, full of guttural and sibilant sounds that should have been incomprehensible. Yet, I understood the intention behind them, a primordial, insatiable hunger that echoed in my mind. It was the road, and it was hungry for me. With every curve, the road altered, sometimes narrowing until it almost brushed against the trees, other times opening into circular clearings where the fog formed slow vortices. My body responded to the drain, my hands trembling on the wheel, a mental fog settling in, making it hard to concentrate. Then, the illusions began. Up ahead on a bend, I saw the porch of my home in Phoenix, my wife, Sarah, waving with a warm smile. I almost hit the brakes, but something about her stillness, her eyes that didn't blink, made me accelerate. The image dissolved into fog as I passed, leaving behind a smell of damp earth and disappointment. Minutes later, my son, Ethan, appeared running down the road, laughing, but his feet didn't touch the ground, and his form began to unravel like smoke. The road was trying to trap me, using my deepest desires against me. I remembered the abandoned vehicles, understanding that each one represented someone who gave in to temptation, who stopped and never left. Here in this place, what you call reality is a thin shell over the abyss. You who are reading this account, in your safe home, with the ticking of a functional clock, cannot imagine the terror of feeling time stagnate, of knowing that every passing second is a piece of your life being consumed by something invisible and ancient. Your certainty that the world is solid and predictable is a comforting illusion, one that this road tears apart without mercy. I kept driving because stopping meant death. The road became more organic, with pulsating veins under the soil, visible through cracks in the ground, as if the earth itself were a living body. The red color of the clay intensified, resembling raw flesh, and the air grew heavy with the smell of iron and decay. The voice on the radio grew more urgent, whispering about satiety and eternity, while my vision began to blur, my limbs heavy as lead. I knew I had to find the heart of this thing, the central point where its existence concentrated. I spotted a marker in the distance, a black, upright stone covered in carved symbols that hurt to look at. It was ancient, older than any civilization I knew, emanating a palpable malice. As I approached, I saw that the stone was connected to a network of veins that pulsed rhythmically, pumping a dark energy that kept the road alive. This was the soul of the nightmare. I parked the truck, dragging myself out, my legs nearly giving way. I walked to the stone, each step a struggle against the force sucking my vitality. With my bare hands, I started digging around the base, the soil damp and warm like viscera. I found black, fibrous roots that contracted at my touch, and I pulled with all my remaining strength, tearing them as the road screamed through the radio, the voice now a roar of pain and rage. The stone shook, and the pulsating veins slowed. I used an iron bar from the truck, striking the stone repeatedly until cracks appeared, releasing a dark, viscous fluid that smelled of molasses and death. With one final effort, I pushed the stone, and it toppled with a dull thud, shattering into pieces. Immediately, the road began to disintegrate, the fog lifting, the trees writhing and withering. The illusions vanished, and time seemed to resume, with the clocks starting again. I climbed back into the truck, which now responded normally, and drove forward, finding EP.40 after a few miles, the real world returning like a sigh of relief. But to this day, I feel a profound fatigue that never leaves, and in my dreams, I still hear the whispers of the road, reminding me that some places in the world are conscious, and they never forget those they almost devoured.